Hello, and welcome to the first 2020 edition of Nelson Mullins Education Law webinar series. We're glad you could join us this morning. My name is Dan Cohen, and I'm a partner on Nelson Mullins Education Law team. Nelson Mullins is an AmLaw 100 firm with about 800 attorneys and policy advisors across 25 offices in 11 states plus Washington, D.C. Among other practices, we have a dedicated team of attorneys focused on serving all legal needs of education institutions, including in the areas of labor and employment, healthcare and issues affecting academic medical programs, construction and real estate, intellectual property, privacy and information security, and unique issues affecting education institutions like student and faculty discipline, sexual misconduct, and athletics. Each month, we will host a free webinar addressing legal topics across these areas, and sometimes more frequently as issues arise, such as the current webinar and our regularly scheduled webinar tomorrow. Please feel free to contact one of our education lawyers if you have any questions about our webinars or any other legal issue affecting education institutions. Today, Nina Gupta, Suzann Wilcox, and Sherry Culves will focus on legal guidance for K-12 schools in light of the emerging coronavirus epidemic. We're going to be focusing on promoting safety and avoiding liability, and Nina, Sherry, and Suzann will talk about how to address employee absenteeism and leave policies, ensuring continuity of services for disabled students, guidance to mitigate against coronavirus exposure and spread, and operational considerations in the event of school closures. Nina Gupta focuses her practice on education law, representing public and private educational entities, vendors, and professionals. She is currently the general counsel to Atlanta Public Schools, a large urban school district serving over 50,000 students. She works directly with governing boards and education leaders to promote effective policy development and compliance. She focuses her practice on providing legal advice to education clients in the areas of disability and discrimination law, employment matters, Title IX, regulatory compliance, and litigation. Suzann Wilcox has been providing legal services to a variety of educational entities for the past 2 decades. Suzann focuses on policy and process development, legal training for staff at all levels, board and superintendent advisement, day-to-day issues impacting schools and students, and technology and privacy concerns. As one of the partners on our team, Suzann works to get clients to a place of yes in a legally compliant fashion. Sherry Culves is a partner at Nelson Mullins with over 20 years of experience in the areas of education law, employment law, and related litigation. She represents numerous school districts, charter schools, private schools, institutions of higher education, and education-related vendors. She focuses on supporting these education-related clients in the areas of regulatory compliance, employment law, and legal issues involving students with disabilities. With that, I will turn it over to the team.
Good morning. This is Suzann Wilcox speaking. I hope you all can hear us nice and loud and clear and are having a good morning today. As you can see from our pictures, we are ready to serve you. Our contact information is there. We just want to encourage you to reach out to either of us, all of us, anytime that you need anything or have any questions that we're not answering here for you today. I think Mr. Cohen, that you just heard from, has really covered this slide very well, but there's a link there for you if you would like to visit our website, learn more about us as a team. We really are boots on the ground, soup to nuts legal services for our educational clients. And so anytime you need anything, I hope you'll think of us. Please note that this webinar is not meant to be legal advice, even though we are lawyers and we are qualified to do that for you. The webinar is really just more general information that you can take to guide you in the right direction. This cannot take into account every factual situation you encounter. And as you all know, even overnight, the situation is changing daily. As your grandpa might say, pigs could be talking tomorrow. We're in Georgia, so I felt like I could share that with you. We'll keep you updated on future available webinars. We do have one tomorrow at 12:30 on due process. If you'd like to be included in that, please feel free to let us know. We'll be happy to add you to that or register you for that. We will be talking about student due process. That will be for colleges, universities, and K-12, and we will be talking in more detail about the coronavirus and COVID-19 as it relates to due process. It was really meant to be a general webinar on that topic, but we'll be zagging a little bit to make sure that's included. You will see a chat feature on your toolbar. Please note that we may or may not have time to take questions. But if you'd like to put questions in there to us, if we have time at the end, we're happy to try to answer some of those. If we don't have time, we're happy to try to incorporate those into a future webinar. So please feel free to ping us with questions as they come up. And if you're logging on with us as a university or college, while this is geared through to our K-12 audience, we want you to know that a lot of this is generally applicable, so please feel free to stay tuned. We'll kind of note for you the things that are more K-12 oriented. And of course, again, if you want to be added to our list, please feel free to email any of us, and we'll be happy to add you to our webinar list going forward. We wanted to include for you some helpful guidance that, again, is changing minute by minute, day by day. On this slide, you'll see three most recent links that we found to be helpful. One is the new considerations for school closure issued by the CDC. The other one is a webinar that was put on by the US DOE on the new OSEP guidance regarding students with disabilities. And the last one is the US DOE guidance. As you all may know, the US DOE issued a series of new guidance related to COVID-19. Some of that is regarding FERPA, some of that is regarding just general information, some of that is regarding students with disabilities. So we just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that and you're keeping track of that. And of course, keep track of the ed.gov website. Make sure you're paying attention to that frequently. As Dan shared with you at the beginning, Nina and I work with two large Metro Atlanta school systems, and we thought it would be helpful to share with you all links to their coronavirus information pages. So if you're interested in seeing some examples of public communications that have gone out, that's available for you there. Just a quick note, if you are not in Georgia and you're in another state, of course, Nelson Mullins serves people all over the country. We just want to remind you to keep track of what your state is allowing and not allowing as far as, for instance, continuity of educational services for students, and keep track of your US DOE, or excuse me, your state DOE's latest guidance. For instance, in Georgia, there really aren't any restrictions on providing teleschool or virtual schooling, but in places like California, at least as of recently as Friday, they may not permit that or may not give funding for that. So just keep track of what your state is doing. We want to make sure that that is said. As you all probably know already, there's various ways that you can continue to provide educational services for students while we're on this shutdown. If you're not on shutdown yet, you're probably thinking about a shutdown, especially in light of the CDC's guidance this morning about avoiding crowds of 50 or more. So we just want to point out to you that there's several different ways you can do that. We, of course, have virtual online platforms. You may already have those that are functional in your district. If you don't, you may be looking for that, and you may be thinking about making an emergency purchase under some of your contracting or purchasing policies for those things. You can also look at telephone or video conferencing. Telephone conferences are fairly low tech. You give students a login number and the teacher a login, and you could get physical or hard copy instructional materials out to your students and staff, and you could do school that way. So that's another way that schools are starting to deal with this. And for some folks, it's going to be a blend, right? They're going to have to use whatever means are available to them, including using bus routes to deliver hard copies or devices as this shutdown continues to roll on.
This is Nina Gupta. Having worked with two pretty large school districts that are currently closed and having to manage continuing educational services for our kids, one issue that is top of mind for us, and I think for school districts everywhere, is equity. And how do we ensure equitable continuity of education for our kids? Whatever model works best for your school district, we know that you're really invested in maximizing access for all your students. And here are some strategies that we found that help mitigate, certainly don't fully fix, but certainly mitigate those equity concerns. If you're using an online platform, it may very well be that some of your students don't have access to devices where they can access your online learning platform or other internet-based resources. And there are some solutions to that. A lot of our schools have devices sitting in their schools that aren't currently assigned to students. Think about all those laptop carts and tablets. You can consider adding those devices to your lending library and letting students who don't have access to those devices take them home during the period of extended school closure. You're going to need to carefully manage the logistics of that. So one, you aren't creating that large gathering of people that the CDC is advising against, and you're not handing out devices that may already have germs sitting on them. So we'll want to wipe down those devices and continue to practice that good hygiene. Also, explore partnerships with businesses and philanthropic organizations for device donations. We are finding that there are a lot of community partners who are very interested and invested in supporting our students and families during this time. And this is a good opportunity to leverage that kind of interest. One thing to keep in mind when you're talking about technology is you want to be aware of E-rate issues. Businesses may not be able to donate directly to your school district, but they may be able to donate to a nonprofit support organization that can then turn around and donate to your school district. So explore partnerships where devices and other donations are funneled through a school support foundation, for instance. Now, even if your kids have devices, they may not be able to access the internet to make them fully functional. So one solution that we have found is working with broadband providers to open up their Wi-Fi networks. Y'all have probably seen the news that there are some broadband providers that have offered free access to the public at large for a certain period of time and a very low price internet essentials packages after that. And they've also removed data caps. Additionally, you can also work with partners to donate hotspots to your students so they can get onto those internet networks. If you find that physical instructional materials are an option for you to either substitute or complement online resources, it may be a challenge to get those resources to kids. If your school district hasn't closed yet, it is probably coming. So go ahead and start making copies of instructional materials, put together packets of worksheets, let those textbooks go home with kids. If you don't usually let that happen, those physical materials can really be a wonderful resource for students. Also, empty your libraries, relax your lending rules, let those books go home with kids because you don't know when they're going to be coming back. And also, finally, consider periodic distribution of those materials if you're facing an extended closure. It may not be possible to put together a 6-week physical learning plan, but it may be possible to do it in 2-week chunks, and then you can distribute them through transportation routes. Again, taking precautions to avoid creating large gatherings and practicing good hygiene so we don't further community spread. And finally, don't forget about your own school district website. As many of y'all know, the Office for Civil Rights has undertaken a national effort to investigate school districts due to their own websites not being accessible to people with disabilities. And that includes not just students, but also parents, employees, and members of the public at large. Your website needs to be accessible for all. Now, we know that in this time, it is not the time to be making big changes to your website, but there are a few basic things to consider. When you're delivering online resources to kids and online services to kids, consider accessibility functions like closed captioning, read aloud software, voice-to-text options, and working with your vendors to maximize accessibility. Also, establish a telephone helpline or an online link where people with disabilities can request assistance or guidance. Again, we know this is not the time to undertake a massive effort to overhaul your website, but be aware of the issue, do the best that you can during this time. Also, know that extended closures will likely impact your annual state assessment. Late last week, the United States Department of Education stated that it would consider a 1-year waiver of state assessment plans if schools were closed during the entire testing window. But they also encouraged school districts to extend the testing window so it wouldn't come to that. You as educators will want to speak up. We know that when students return to school, your focus is going to be on remediation, not preparation for testing, because nothing really takes the place of that face-to-face instruction with a teacher. So you're going to want to spend your time and energy making up for that lost time. Let your state and federal contacts hear from you about the impact of students of being away from school and how testing just shouldn't be the main priority when they return. But we do have breaking news. Just this morning here in Georgia, our state superintendent of education suspended state testing administration and other accountability requirements due to the COVID-19 outbreak. So we're already seeing some relief from those kinds of federal requirements.
Good morning, this is Sherry Culves. I'm going to speak with you this morning about how to support your students with disabilities during these periods of closure. This is really aimed at our K-12 audience and compliance with Section 504 and the IDEA. I'll start by talking about whether COVID-19 provides eligibility for students who are not otherwise already eligible under those two laws. The guidance we have from the US DOE is that a student who is not already disabled is not likely to qualify for eligibility under Section 504 or the IDEA from a routine case of COVID-19. However, a word of caution is that if the illness develops longer-term complications, resulting in extended absences for the student, that situation could result in the student eventually becoming eligible under one or both of the laws. Therefore, we want to put a little reminder on you to continue to follow your normal child find and evaluation procedures for those unique students. For your students who are eligible under the 504 or IDEA, we have some guidance for you on how to comply with those FAPE standards under both of the laws. I'll first talk about what we call in the industry the 10-day rule. In order for Section 504 or IDEA obligations to kick in, the school-wide closures or an individual student's absence must generally extend for more than 10 consecutive days. Thus, for many of us whose schools have announced closures for 1 or 2 weeks, if that is all that occurs, the schools can generally assume that they will not have a FAPE violation on their hands. However, if the schools do close for more than 10 consecutive days, or if an individual student with a disability is absent for more than 10 days, then schools can assume that they need to convene their individual 504 and IEP teams to determine whether those absences for the particular student involved resulted in a denial of FAPE and requires compensatory services. This individualized analysis of compensatory services is really the overarching principle of how to comply with these two laws and COVID-19. We do have some guidance for you on advanced planning and interim services during these closures. Many of you are in the process of developing interim measures for educating all of your students. This is fantastic, and many of these system-wide measures may in fact mitigate against the educational loss that will occur for individual students. There are a few key points, however, to keep in mind when developing your plans. First, we are getting a lot of questions about whether we need to hold IEP meetings now in advance of the closures to address amendments to the IEP. If you can feasibly and practically do that for all of your individual high-needs students, then that is fantastic. But the reality of the situation that holding mass meetings on the front end of this crisis is likely not practical for most of you. The longer this situation drags on, the more you should reassess whether an immediate IEP meeting is needed for one of your students. The next question we're getting is whether school districts have an obligation to provide special education services for disabled students while school is closed. The US DOE has advised that if the district is going to provide general education services to non-disabled students, then the district likewise has an obligation to provide services to its disabled population. If the districts don't include the disabled students, then they're going to run afoul of equal access and non-discrimination requirements. We understand that many of you are concerned with the guidance that the US DOE came out saying that if any services are provided to general education students, the district must also provide disabled students with FAPE during these periods of closure. We know that the practical reality of the situation is that districts are not equipped to provide FAPE to all students with disabilities during these immediate closures. You should not hold back, however, in providing these system-wide interventions simply because an individual student may not receive FAPE. Instead, do the very best that you can do. Special education teachers should be focused on providing modified lessons and projects, providing families with resources to support the students' goals and objectives, and making the teachers and related service providers available for email chats, phone calls, video conferencing, etc. We now have to turn to the question of what to do about compensatory services decisions. Again, if the schools are closed for longer than 10 school days, or if an individual student is absent for more than 10 days because of COVID-19, your Section 504 and IEP teams will need to convene after the fact to determine whether the student requires compensatory services. For many of you, the feasibility of how to hold so many meetings is particularly daunting. You simply may not be able to hold all of those meetings right away when the district returns to normal operations. Our advice to you is to triage this by holding the meetings for your most needy students first. You can send out written communications to your family and to your staff of disabled students, asking them to self-identify whether they believe the student needs immediate consideration for compensatory services or whether it can wait. Try to hold those most needy meetings first as soon as possible and before summer break so that you can use that window to provide any compensatory services. For the remainder of your students, add an agenda item to their annual review meeting and address the impact of COVID-19 at that time. When you get to those meetings, similar to ESY discussions, possible factors for an IEP or Section 504 team to consider in making a decision as to whether compensatory services will be needed are items such as the severity of the student's disability, the length of the absence, and the amount of missed services, whether the student received any meaningful interim services to mitigate against that potential educational loss, and certainly at this point the district could consider the mass educational services that were pushed out to all students, the extent of regression of the student on his or her goals and objectives, how quickly the student is able to recoup those lost skills, and whether the student was working on any emerging skills, as well as their individual availability and willingness to take on additional services. Finally, I want to spend just a minute to talk to you about what to do with the timelines in Section 504 and the IDEA. The USDOE has not yet issued guidance on what to do about annual review deadlines, MDR deadlines, evaluation and eligibility determination deadlines, or even ERS deadlines. It's possible and even likely that many of you will become technically out of compliance in light of the need to cancel those meetings. Our legal guidance is, again, to proceed with prioritizing the parent's right to meaningful participation in those meetings. That looks like not forcing a meeting to proceed if the parent cannot attend, and not forcing the meeting to proceed if the required staff members are not available. If the parents and the staff are available and willing to attend, then consider holding those IEP meetings via telephone conference. If that is also not possible, then we advise sending home written communication to the family along the lines of a prior written notice documentation that identifies the situation and the district's plan. For example, your plan to continue the current IEP in place until the meeting can be held. Of course, once school resumes to normal operations, you should hold the meeting as soon as possible and again consider with the team whether any compensatory services are needed in light of the delay. Finally, with respect to court-related deadlines, such as deadlines for answering due process hearing requests and state DOE complaints, it is our understanding at this point that those deadlines are proceeding as normal. You should work with your legal counsel to ensure that all of those deadlines are met, and that if you receive a complaint while the district is closed, you should make sure your lawyer gets it right away.
This is Suzann again, and we're going to shift from students with disabilities to operational issues, which is likely what is taking up most of your day, or at least the questions that make you sit straight up in your bed in the middle of the night, as it does for us. If it makes you feel any better, we're right there with you. Not on this slide, but I'll go ahead and share with you, is FERPA. So that's the Families with Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That's our Privacy Act. I just want to remind you that you do have quite a bit of leeway under FERPA to share information in an imminent health or safety emergency. And I would say in 90% of the places where you are, you have some sort of state of emergency has been called. Even if it hasn't, if you have an individual health and safety emergency, that's okay too. So in those situations, you can share what information you need to share in order to address the emergency. For instance, if someone is ill and needs medical attention, or if we need to alert the Department of Human Resources, or if you need to continue to alert child welfare authorities to abuse or neglect, you can do that. Just make sure you document who you shared it with, what you shared, and then what the emergency was. When this situation calms down, you are going to need to put in that child's file a note that you did share it, why, and who you shared it with. All right, so moving on to student discipline. And again, let me tell you, we do have a seminar tomorrow at 12:30. If you'd like to be included in that, please feel free to email me, Suzann Wilcox, or really any of us. We'll be happy to send you a link to get you registered for that. That is free, of course, as all of our webinars will be. With student discipline, this is going to create some unusual situations. So let's just first start with remembering the intent for suspensions and expulsions, which is really to remove a student from the learning environment because they demonstrated they can't abide by the rules and function in a school building. And while punitive discipline is a factor to consider, many states, including Georgia, have a preference to keep student education going even when removed from the building. So with schools being let out or being considered to be let out, you may have a situation where you feel like you want to let students on short-term suspension or students who are sitting and waiting for a hearing to continue their educational services. So let's talk about short-term suspended students. And when I say short-term, I mean less than 10 days, or 10 days or less out of school. If you are not allowing them to participate in any virtual or teleschool options that you're making available to other students during closures, our concern would be that they may say that their suspension is continuing and you're going past the 10 days that you know you have under Lopez, and that would be a problem for due process. So what you may want to consider is, for short-term suspensions, go ahead and suspending the suspension and letting parents know that they're going to be allowed to participate in these online programs, and that perhaps you will either tack on those days at the end when school is back, or more likely go ahead and just say time served, because at this point you really want to get kids back in the building when school gets back in service, and their suspension will be long done by then. The other students, these are the long-term suspensions, which is more than 10 days. They're actually waiting for disciplinary hearing. We'd recommend that you make a chart of who had hearings coming and which day of suspensions they were on, and then notify the parents that hearings are being postponed and they'll be rescheduled, and you'll be reaching out and ask them to please make sure they have a good number, email, address on file with us, which we know is a struggle normally. And then we'll have to send them new notices when we know school is opening. The chart will let us know who's priority reschedule. And again, you have to wonder, do you want to let these students take part in teleschool and then just suspend the suspension, tack on the days on the other end? As far as hearing timelines, that certainly would be more clean for you, because then you know you haven't gone over the 10 days contemplated by Lopez. So something to think about there. And for students who are already long-term suspended or expelled and they're already out, that's a more complicated issue. If you're already giving them some sort of way to make up their work, you may want to consider letting them teleschool with everyone else. If you have some sort of safety issue or they had a bad interaction with a school staff member, you may want to go ahead and put some specific guidance in place for those students to say, don't contact this teacher or don't contact that teacher. Or if you contact this teacher about anything other than educational issues, then we'll, ramp up your discipline when you come back, something along those lines. So be thinking about how you're going to manage those disciplinary issues.
So this is Sherry Culves again, back to talk to you about the operational issues involving employees when we have long-term school closures. The first step that I want you to consider is, are you going to require your employees to work while schools are closed? Employees that are working or have certain call-in restrictions are entitled to be paid. So as I start through this section, we're going to talk about those employees who do have some form of obligation of continued work while your schools are closed. For those employees, communicate with them what those work expectations are or their on-call expectations. Make sure that those employees understand whether and how they will be paid and that your plans may change. Work with your lawyer to make sure that your plans comply with any existing employee contracts, state laws, or collective bargaining agreements. And ensure that you do not inadvertently create a new contract with your employees when you are rolling out your new plans. For your non-exempt employees, establish a process for time worked to be recorded and entered into your school's timekeeping systems. This is necessary to ensure compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Operationally, you should obtain updated contact information before your school shuts down. Have a communication plan in place for communicating with your staff and your team. If you have face-to-face trainings or meetings already scheduled, convert those to a virtual format. Also consider establishing a daily check-in time with your team, either by Skype or by phone, to update your daily work expectations. If your team members interact with external stakeholders, make sure that you have a plan in place for that customer service. Commit your staff to an acceptable response period for email inquiries or telephone calls. Just as with work that is performed in the school building, establish a clear expectation of work tasks, objectives, and performance indicators, and keep track of those. Organize the work tasks and assign the task owners. Also, make sure to get feedback from your team, as they will know what is feasible and what is not, and they'll be able to issue spot for you. When you are assigning tasks, make sure to do that in an equitable fashion to avoid discrimination claims. One example is to ask your head custodian to be the individual that returns to school to unlock the building if you're trying to decide between which custodian needs to come in and perform that work. Proceeding with the most senior employee is an objective, non-discriminatory way to handle those kinds of issues. Also, make sure that you've got a plan for determining what equipment can go home with the employees, what processes need to be put in place for logging and tracking that equipment, etc. Have a plan in place for protecting the confidentiality of sensitive information that employees need to access when they are working remotely. And then notify all of your non-employees, people such as your independent contractors, your student teachers, volunteers, speakers, etc., that your school is closing and what your expectation is for whether you intend for them to continue work or not. Finally, have a process in place for employees to report COVID-19 exposure, testing, and diagnosis. But as with any medical issues, ensure you have a separate place to keep that information and that you protect the confidentiality of it. Of course, sick employees should not report to any physical work sites. Employees who can continue and are willing to continue working remotely while ill may continue to do so. However, if they are too sick to work or their work requires them to be in person, then they should notify their supervisor and not do so. You should have a process in place for having those employees submit leave requests during this time. Now I'm going to turn to the question of how to handle employees who are not working during periods of school closure, and the question of whether the schools must pay them anyway. In a minute, I'll also tell you some updates on the House bill that was passed this weekend, which will drastically change this for us in about 15 days. But for the moment, we'll stick with compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act and the existing guidance under the law. The first step for you is to understand the difference between your hourly and your salaried employees, your non-exempt and exempt employees. There are restrictions on how much you can dock an employee's pay if they are a non-exempt or a salaried, if they are an exempt or a salaried employee. For those exempt employees, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, if the employee is out sick the entire work week, or if the district closes schools or the employee's office the entire work week, and they perform no work for you, then the district is not obligated to pay them for that week. However, if they are only partially absent during a work week, then assuming that your school has a bona fide leave plan under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you can do the following. First, you can require the employee to use their sick or personal leave for any full day or any partial day absence. And if they run out of leave, you can dock that employee's compensation for any full day absence, but not any partial day. For your non-exempt, your hourly employees, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the district is only required to compensate them for the hours they actually work. Thus, if the district requires them to stay home and not work, you are not obligated to pay them. However, if they do, or if they are suffered or permitted to work, as that term is used under the law, then you are required to both keep track of the hours that they work under the record-keeping requirement and to compensate them. Now I want to turn for just a minute to tell you a little bit about the House of Representatives bill that was passed in the early hours of Saturday morning called the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. It is now heading to the Senate, so it is not final yet, and there are several provisions that still need to get cleaned up, and some of which still contradict themselves. But by all accounts, it has broad support, and we should see a bill passed this week. The first main point for you to know is that it expands drastically the Family Medical Leave Act. As it reads now, the Family Medical Leave Act only applies to employers with over 50 or more employees, if they're a private employer, or, of course, to all government employers. Under the proposed law, the Family Medical Leave Act for COVID-related absences is going to expand to all private employers with 500 or fewer employees. Government employers are going to be bound under either law. So, schools with one employee would now be covered under the Family Medical Leave Act for COVID-related absences. Additionally, we know that traditionally the Family Medical Leave Act has a 12-month waiting period and a 1,250-hour requirement before an employee is eligible for FMLA leave. Under the new proposal for COVID-related absences, all an employee has to do to be eligible for COVID absences is to have worked for the employer for 30 days. There are additional changes to the FMLA leave that I want to bring to your attention. The reasons that an employee could take what I'm going to call COVID-related leave are the following. This is broader than what you're used to under the FMLA. Number one, to adhere to a requirement or a recommendation to quarantine due to the employee's own exposure or symptoms of coronavirus. Number two, to care for an at-risk family member who is likewise adhering to a requirement or a recommendation to quarantine due to exposure or symptoms of the coronavirus. By the way, the list of covered family members that an employee could take leave to care for is broader than the traditional list under the FMLA. It is also permissible to take leave to care for and supervise a child whose school or place of child care has been closed or whose child care provider is unavailable due to a coronavirus. Under this section of the proposed law, the first 2 weeks of FMLA leave will be, may be, unpaid. However, in a minute, I'm going to tell you about mandatory sick leave benefits that are part of phase 2 of this law. If the employee takes the first 2 weeks of FMLA leave, they may choose to substitute their own vacation leave or sick leave, but the employer may not require them to do so. After the first 2 weeks of leave, the employers must continue to provide the employee with paid FMLA leave at a rate of no less than 2/3 of the employee's usual rate of pay for up to 3 months. There are some dollar figure caps to that. However, as you can imagine, this is going to have a substantial impact on your planning and your budgeting. As with all traditional FMLA leave, the leave is job protected, meaning that the employer must return the employee to the same or equivalent position upon the return to work. There are some special rules and hardship exceptions for employers with less than 25 or 50 employees. Now I want to briefly turn to the section of the new bill called the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. This portion of the bill also applies to all government employers, and then it also applies to all private employers with less than 500 employees, including those that only have one. This portion of the law requires employers to provide employees with 2 weeks of paid sick leave, which accrues immediately and can be used immediately, regardless of how long the employee has been employed. More information on that is still coming down, and we expect some minor amendments in the next few days, so please stay tuned. There are anti-retaliation provisions, notice provisions, enforcement remedies, all contained in this law. There are also some tax credits available to offset this requirement, but only for small businesses and not for government employers such as colleges, state colleges, and public school districts. There is no carryover of the leave. It expires on December 31st, and it must be used for a COVID-related absence. Both of the acts that I've just highlighted for you begin coverage 15 days after they are passed. And again, the expectation is that we will have a bill passed this week. We are watching this closely. The biggest takeaway for you is that if you are already stretching your limits of what you think you can financially do for employees in terms of leaving them on paid leave during these periods of closure, but not maximizing their work output, please understand that you are about to have a lot more obligation to pay them coming down the tracks. In light of this, we are standing by to assist clients on how to adjust.
And just a reminder, you do have a chat for those of us who might have joined a little later. You do have a chat feature, so if there's any questions you want to share that we haven't covered that you'd like to have answered later, or if we have a little bit of time at the end, which I'm not sure we will, but we'll be happy to try, we're happy to answer those questions. And if your mouth is hanging open, don't worry. All of us in this room, though you can't see our faces, feel the same way. This is unprecedented, historic change, and we're all just scrambling to keep up. So stay tuned, and we'll make sure we keep you up with the latest information.
So this is Nina again. As we're all catching our breath after learning about the potential employment consequences that may be coming down the line for us, and it's a big if. It has not been enacted, but we know something big is coming. There's lots of other kinds of operational issues that your school districts are going to want to consider as you're managing school slowdowns or school closures. So I'm just going to go through those pretty quickly here. First of all, travel. If you haven't already, limit or eliminate altogether all work-related travel, all of your field trips, all of your events and gatherings. Those things are getting canceled anyway, but if they haven't been canceled, cancel them yourself. All the guidance is to avoid those kinds of large gatherings. And while kids may not physically be coming to school, you still have an operation to run. You still have a business to run in a school district, and that means getting the bills paid and paying your vendors. We are all working through this together, and I think vendors are in a situation where they understand if there's going to be a bit of a delay in payment. Prioritize those payments that are critical to keep the lights on, keep the water running, et cetera, and go ahead and make them. But then reach out to your other vendors, let them know there's going to be a delay, and I am confident that your vendors are going to work with you. your schools are still going to be accepting deliveries. So you'll want to prioritize those deliveries that are, again, absolutely essential for continuing operations. You don't want to run out of soap and paper towels at a time like this. You don't want to run out of cleaning supplies at a time like this. So make sure that those get prioritized, cancel or reschedule those that are not absolutely essential. And then those that are essential, make sure you've designated someone in the building to accept delivery for them. As we move our employees to teleworking, we'll want to make sure that their technology is up to speed and able to handle the load that we're putting on it. What we have found to be very effective is making sure that we've installed VPNs, virtual private networks, on employee-issued devices to allow them to access school district networks. And then before you turn them loose, before you send them home, test those VPNs, test those virtual meeting capabilities before final deployment to make sure that they're functional. Have all of your employees to change their voicemail to reflect a potential or an actual school closure. Ask callers to leave an email address for reply, and establish a helpline for your employees that may have technology issues. That can be staffed by your usual help desk personnel, and of course we'll be doing it remotely, but just like in every other school day, people are going to have technology problems, and you'll want them to have someone to call to get help with it. Additionally, food and nutrition and meal distribution. So many of our students eat 2 of their 3 meals a day only because they come to school. And school districts around the country that are facing closure are really scrambling and working hard to continue that meal service for our students. Now, last week, the USDA had granted a flexibility waiver to allow schools to operate their seamless summer programs during this period of COVID-19 related closure. Typically, those schools that have at least 50% free or reduced lunch percentage that have already been designated by a school district prior to serve meals, cold meals over the summer. And they're served on a grab-and-go basis. There's no kids sitting in your cafeteria eating. Go ahead and operationalize a plan to implement your summer feeding program during this period of closure. You can also put those meals onto your buses and distribute them in your communities along bus routes. There are obvious practical considerations to this. The data about coronavirus is changing every day, so we have to do a very complicated balancing between meeting our kids' needs for food and nutrition versus not contributing to a pandemic, and figuring out what that acceptable risk is, and that's not a very clear answer. But certainly you will want to deep clean any kitchens and buses that you intend to use. You will need your employees to come in and prepare and distribute that food, and you may want to allow only those who are not considered high risk for COVID-19 related complications to do that work. The CDC has told us that those who are high risk are older adults and those with chronic health conditions like heart disease or diabetes or lung disease. You'll also, now is the time to reach out and partner with your community food banks, catering companies, food delivery services, and the like to supplement your own meal services as well, and possibly look at delivery options also. Additionally, your schools need to be secure. They're not going to be full of people all day long, so you'll want to secure your facilities. Before you do a final school closure, do a walkthrough. Make sure that your buildings are locked, that all the windows are closed, that all the valuable equipment such as laptops and projectors and the like has been secured in a locked cabinet. Determine who's going to have access to the building during closure, and anyone else, make sure they return their access badges. If you have any after-school events or any community groups that might be using your facilities, designate someone to notify them of cancellation of events. The last thing you want is a community group showing up and wondering where their meeting's supposed to be. And make sure that your building alarm and security system is operational, as are your perimeter cameras and lighting. Empty school districts, or empty school buildings rather, can certainly be a target for theft or vandalism, and we want to minimize that to the extent that we can. Finally, even though your schools might be closed, new students are going to be showing up and wanting to enroll. So to manage that process, Establish an online registration and enrollment system, again with a helpline for families who may not have access to technology or may have some trouble with the technology, and determine whether or not new students are going to begin immediately or whether they're going to begin receiving services when school reopens, keeping in mind that for our disabled students, that decision may have consequences for compensatory education down the line. Now, when this national crisis is over, we're going to want to reopen our schools and invite our kids back. Start drafting a protocol for reopening now, because you want to be able to operationalize it as quickly as possible. So prior reopening, here are some considerations you'll want to consider. Food service. Do you need to order supplies to resume a hot breakfast and lunch program? Or perhaps you can just continue your seamless summer program and provide cold meals for a few days while your supply chains are getting back up and running. Your instructional materials. Remember all those library books and textbooks and laptops that you let go home with kids? You're going to need them back. Ask your families to return them before opening, but go ahead and assume that not all of them are going to be returned immediately or if ever. So go ahead and order some additional materials and develop a plan for sharing the materials that you do have in the interim. Before you reopen, you'll want to inspect your buildings. Are they safe for students and faculty to return? Is everything clean and operational? Is there still soap in the bathrooms? Are the lights working? Is the technology working? Maintain a status update for your facilities so that you know when they're ready for occupancy, and if they're not, a plan for remediation, including ordering supplies and scheduling repairs. Your buses need to be ready for action as well. Are they clean? Are they road ready? Do they need maintenance? Do they need to be fueled up? These are all things that you'll want to solve before your schools reopen. And then develop a plan for your staff to return as well. Prioritize how and when various categories of staff are going to be returned, how they're going to be notified, and what their job day is going to look like.
If you are still sitting upright and haven't had some sort of cardiac event during this information, we just want to remind you that we're here to help. Here is our contact information, our phone numbers, our emails. All three of us are happy to help. You can email one of us, you can email all three of us, whatever is good for you. This is going to be rapidly, and when I say rapidly, I mean every day is a brand new world for us in the education world, and same for us as education attorneys. So we just want you to know that we are here for you. We are very much see ourselves as a team member at the table with our clients. We work with them. This is just a small overview of some of the issues that are going on. There are many issues that we didn't have time to touch on or we could only just mention. So if there's anything you need, please let us know. If you have a suggestion for another webinar topic, let us know that too. We're happy to send these out. Again, these are going to be free webinars. We'll definitely be expanding on this series on COVID-19, and we really appreciate all of your attention. And thank you so much for the good work you're doing for students. We know you haven't slept. We know you may not have seen your family, or your family may be just a distant memory to you at this point, and we feel your pain, and we're right there with you, and we really hope that you stay safe, you stay healthy, and so do your students and staff. And with that, we will sign off, and please let us know if we can assist you. Good luck out there.